Close your eyes and picture a Wild West saloon. You probably see swinging doors, a polished mahogany bar, a piano player in the corner, and a tense poker game about to erupt into gunfire. Maybe there's a chandelier overhead, a mirror behind the bar reflecting bottles of fine whiskey, and a crowd of rough men in wide-brimmed hats nursing their drinks in silence. That image is burned into our collective memory, reinforced by a century of Western films, dime novels, and romanticized retellings of frontier life. And like most things about the Wild West, it's not entirely wrong, but it's not entirely right either. The real story of saloons is stranger, more human, and far more important than Hollywood ever captured. Imagine this instead. You're a miner in 1850s Colorado, and you've just finished a 14-hour shift breaking rock in freezing temperatures. You walk into the only saloon within 50 miles, a canvas tent held up by 4 wooden posts with a dirt floor and a wood-burning stove in the center. There's no bar, just a plank of wood resting on 2 barrels. The man behind it pours you a shot of something called Coffin Varnish, a mixture of raw alcohol, burnt sugar, tobacco juice, and turpentine. It costs you a quarter, nearly half a day's wages. You drink it warm because refrigeration doesn't exist out here yet. Afterward, you wipe your mouth with a communal towel that 50 other men have already used that day, each one leaving behind their sweat, their spit, and God knows what else. There's no poker game, no gunfight, just you, a handful of other exhausted men, and the only place within 100 miles where you can sit down, get warm, and talk to another human being. That was the reality for tens of thousands of men during the early days of westward expansion. And as strange as it sounds, that tent, and the thousands of saloons that followed, became the most important institution on the American frontier. Because here's the thing about saloons that nobody tells you. They weren't just bars. In the early boomtowns and mining camps scattered across the West, saloons were often the only infrastructure that existed. No churches, no courthouses, no town halls, no schools, just saloons. On Sunday mornings, a traveling preacher might hold a Baptist sermon in the same room where men had been gambling and drinking until 3 in the morning. On Monday, the town council would meet at those same tables to vote on local laws. On Tuesday, a judge might arrive and hold court, handling disputes over land claims and livestock. On Wednesday, it was back to business, whiskey, card games, and whatever entertainment the saloon owner could scrape together. Saloons were makeshift community centers in a world that had no communities yet. They were where deals were brokered, news was shared, friendships were made, and sometimes, yes, occasionally, violence erupted. But that violence was the exception, not the rule. Most nights in most saloons were quiet, even boring. Men drank to cope with loneliness, not to start fights. They played cards to pass the time, not to shoot each other over a bad hand. And the drinks? Forget smooth bourbon or ice-cold beer. The early saloon alcohol was borderline poisonous, mixed with whatever the owner could find to stretch his supply and maximize profit. Some bartenders would light whiskey on fire to prove its potency to skeptical customers, a sales tactic that gave rise to the term firewater. Others served beer warm because ice was a luxury that wouldn't reach most of the frontier until the 1880s, when railroads and refrigeration finally arrived. But even as saloons evolved, as tent structures gave way to wooden buildings, as raw alcohol gave way to actual whiskey, as dirt floors gave way to wooden planks, their role remained the same. They were the glue holding fractured, transient communities together. By 1890, Denver, Colorado had 478 saloons. That's not a typo. 478. In 1860, the same city had only 30. The explosion in saloon construction tracked directly with population growth, railroad expansion, and the establishment of permanent settlements. Wherever people went west, saloons followed. And wherever saloons opened, towns grew around them. The people running these places weren't just bartenders, they were community pillars, armed with shotguns to keep the peace, skilled enough to mix drinks that didn't kill their customers, and charismatic enough to mediate disputes and organize entertainment. Saloon owners were often the most influential figures in town. They were called professors, a title of respect that reflected the gravity of their work. By 1900, there were 50,000 of them across the United States, each one competing to offer the best experience, the coldest beer, the fairest card games. And the games? Oh, the games. But forget poker. The most popular gambling game in the Wild West wasn't five-card draw or Texas Hold'em. It was Faro, a fast-paced card game that could accommodate unlimited players and required almost no skill. Men would sit at Faro tables for hours, betting small amounts on each round, chasing the hope of a big win that might change their fortunes. Some won, most lost. Either way, they kept playing because what else was there to do? But not everyone saw saloons as harmless gathering places. By the late 1800s, a growing movement of social reformers, Christian temperance advocates, and women's rights activists began targeting saloons as symbols of moral decay. Organizations like the Anti-Saloon League staged protests outside saloon doors, warning passers-by of the dangers of alcohol, gambling, and prostitution. Some women, most famously Carrie Nation, took matters into their own hands, literally smashing saloons to pieces with axes in broad daylight. The irony, of course, is that saloons had done more to build civilization in the West than almost any other institution. But they had also become convenient scapegoats for every social ill of the era. And by the early 20th century, the temperance movement would succeed in its ultimate goal: prohibition. The beginning of the end for the Wild West saloon. So what were saloons actually like? They were vital and flawed. They were crude and sophisticated. They were places of community and places of vice. They were, in short, exactly what you'd expect when you take desperate, ambitious, lonely people and give them a single space to gather in the middle of nowhere. And this is the real story of Wild West saloons, the one Hollywood never told. Before you could belly up to a bar and order a cold beer in the Wild West, you had to survive what saloons were actually serving. And in the early days of the frontier, that was no small feat. The drinks had names that should have been warning labels: Coffin Varnish, Tarantula Juice, Red Eye, Tanglefoot, Busthead, and Rot Gut. These weren't clever marketing gimmicks. They were accurate descriptions of what you were about to put in your body. The names matched the ingredients, and the ingredients were, to put it mildly, creative. In the earliest saloons, those canvas tents and lean-to structures scattered across mining camps and remote settlements, quality alcohol was nearly impossible to come by. There were no distributors, no supply chains, and certainly no regulations. Saloon owners had to make do with whatever they could get their hands on, and what they could get was usually raw, unrefined alcohol that needed to be stretched as far as possible to turn a profit. So they cut it with anything. A typical batch of early saloon whiskey might start with a base of raw grain alcohol, turpentine, or even industrial ethanol. To that, the saloon owner would add burnt sugar for color, making the liquid look more like aged whiskey than the clear, harsh spirit it actually was. Then came the flavoring agents: chewing tobacco for a smoky bite, a pinch of gunpowder for kick, and sometimes a splash of ammonia or strychnine to give it a burn that convinced drinkers they were getting their money's worth. It sounds insane, because it was. But for the men drinking it, there weren't many alternatives. You either drank what the saloon had, or you didn't drink at all. And after a day of backbreaking labor in a mine shaft, or a week alone on the open range herding cattle, most men chose to drink. The wildest part? They didn't even get it cold. Forget the image of a frosty mug of beer or a whiskey on the rocks. In the early days of the frontier, refrigeration didn't exist in any practical form. Ice was a luxury reserved for the wealthiest cities back east. And even there, it had to be harvested from frozen lakes in winter and stored in insulated warehouses. Out on the frontier, in places like Nevada, Wyoming, and Colorado, ice was functionally non-existent. So drinks were served warm, or at best, room temperature. If you ordered a beer, it would be somewhere between 55 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit, poured from a barrel that had been sitting in the saloon for days or weeks. If you ordered whiskey, it came straight from the bottle, no ice, no chill, just raw alcohol hitting your throat like liquid fire. It wasn't until the 1880s that this began to change. That's when Adolphus Busch, the co-founder of Anheuser-Busch, revolutionized the beer industry by introducing artificial refrigeration and pasteurization on a national scale. Budweiser became the first mass-produced beer that could be shipped across the country and served cold, and it changed the game entirely. Suddenly, saloons in even the most remote territories could offer their patrons a cold beer, and the difference was night and day. But before that innovation arrived, men drank what they had. And what they had was often borderline poisonous. One of the most famous drinks of the era was called firewater, a term that has since worked its way into the popular lexicon as a general slang for strong alcohol. But the origin of the name is far more literal and far more entertaining than most people realize. Firewater wasn't a specific cocktail or mixed drink. It was just whiskey. But the name came from the sales tactics used by traders and settlers during their interactions with Native American tribes in the early 19th century. Picture this. A group of white traders arrives at a native camp hoping to exchange goods for furs, hides, or other valuable resources. They've brought barrels of homemade whiskey with them, but the native traders are skeptical. They've been burned before, literally and figuratively, by low-quality alcohol, and they want proof that what's being offered is worth the trade. So the traders pull out a demonstration. They pour a generous amount of whiskey over an open campfire. The alcohol ignites immediately, causing the flames to leap higher and burn brighter, the fire roaring to life in a dramatic display of potency. The message was clear. This isn't watered-down swill. This is the real deal. High alcohol content, strong enough to make fire dance. The tactic worked. Native traders were impressed, deals were made, and the term firewater was born. It became shorthand for any strong alcohol, and the name stuck around long after the original context faded from memory. But here's the thing. Even firewater, as crude as it was still just whiskey. It wasn't mixed with tobacco or turpentine or any of the other nightmare ingredients that filled the bottles at early saloons. In that sense, it was actually one of the better options available. The truly dangerous drinks were the ones saloon owners concocted themselves, the ones they sold to miners and cowboys and drifters who were too tired, too lonely, or too desperate to care what they were drinking. Men would down a shot of Coffin Varnish, wince at the burn, and then order another. Not because it tasted good, it didn't. Not because it was safe, it wasn't. But because it was there, and it was all they had. And the cost? That varied wildly depending on where you were. In the smallest, most remote camps, places like the tent saloons that dotted the early frontier, a shot of whiskey might cost you just a few cents, 5 cents, maybe 10. But it was cheap because the clientele was broke. Miners, laborers, and young men fresh off the wagon trail didn't have disposable income, and saloon owners knew it. They priced their drinks low to keep people coming back. But venture farther from the beaten path, deep into the Yukon, for example, or into isolated mountain territories, and the prices skyrocketed. In those places, a single shot of whiskey could cost 50 cents, a staggering amount considering that the average laborer might only make $1 or $2 a day. The markup wasn't greed, it was logistics. Getting alcohol to those remote locations required extraordinary effort, and saloon owners passed that cost on to their customers. Meanwhile, in more established towns along the railroad lines, places like Dodge City, Tombstone, and Denver, prices stabilized. A quarter would get you a shot of whiskey or 2 beers, served warm but at least reasonably safe to drink. These were the saloons that could afford to stock better alcohol, the ones that had access to supply chains and competition that kept quality from sinking too low. Still, even in the fanciest saloons of the late 19th century, the drinks were a far cry from what we'd consider acceptable today. The bartenders, called professors for their supposed expertise, did their best to mix cocktails and serve quality liquor. But they were working with limited resources and even more limited oversight. There were no health inspections, no FDA regulations, no one checking to make sure the whiskey wasn't laced with strychnine or the beer wasn't turning into vinegar in the barrel. You drank at your own risk, and most men did. She is because the alternative, sobriety in the lonely, brutal monotony of frontier life, was somehow worse. The drinks were terrible. The prices were inconsistent. The safety was non-existent. But for the men who walked into those early saloons, it didn't matter. They weren't there for the quality of the alcohol. They were there because the saloon was the only place that felt like home. And that desperation, that need for connection and relief, is what kept the doors open and the drinks pouring, poison or not. The drinks were terrible. The prices were inconsistent. The safety was non-existent. But for the men who walked into those early saloons, none of that mattered. Because before you could even order that poisonous drink, you had to find a saloon first. And in the earliest days of the frontier, that meant looking for something that barely qualified as a building at all. Forget swinging doors and piano music. Forget polished bars and mirrored walls. The first saloons of the Wild West weren't buildings. They were temporary structures thrown together in a matter of hours, designed to serve transient populations that might disappear just as quickly as they arrived. Mining camps, wagon stops, and remote trading posts needed places for men to gather, and enterprising businessmen met that need with the bare minimum: shelter, alcohol, and a few flat surfaces to lean on. These weren't the iconic saloons you picture when you think of the Old West. These were rough, crude, and often pathetic-looking operations that barely qualified as structures at all. The most common early saloon was a canvas tent. Imagine a prospector's tent, but larger, maybe 15 feet by 20 feet if the owner was ambitious. 4 wooden posts were driven into the ground to mark the corners, and a rough sheet of canvas or homemade tarp was stretched across the top to form a roof. The walls, if they existed at all, were more canvas or perhaps a few spare planks nailed together to block the wind. The floor was dirt, not wooden planks, not stone, just the ground, trampled flat by boots and weather. In wet seasons, it turned to mud. In dry seasons, it turned to dust. Either way, you were standing on the earth itself, and that was fine, because no one expected luxury. Inside, the furnishings were minimal. At the center of the space, you'd usually find a single wood-burning stove. This wasn't for cooking. Most saloons didn't serve food in the early days. The stove was there to keep people from freezing to death during the brutal frontier winters, when temperatures could plummet well below zero and the thin canvas walls did almost nothing to hold in heat. Surrounding the stove were a few makeshift tables. And when I say makeshift, I mean it. These weren't carpentry projects. They were flat sheaths of wood, sometimes just a single plank, resting on tree stumps, barrels, or half-sanded pedestals. If you were lucky, the surface was level. If you weren't, your drink slid to one side and you learned to hold your glass. There were no chairs. Men stood, leaned against the support posts, or sat directly on the ground. Comfort wasn't the priority. Warmth and companionship were. At one end of the tent, you'd find the bar, a term used generously. This was usually just another plank of wood, and this time, propped up on 2 barrels or a rough-hewn counter. Behind it stood the saloon keeper, who might also be the owner, the bartender, the bouncer, and the only other person in the building. He'd have a few bottles of homemade alcohol, maybe a jug or two of something that vaguely resembled whiskey, and a tin cup or glass that every customer shared. That was it. That was the saloon. But as bare bones as these setups were, they served a critical function. In the early days of westward expansion, the 1820s through the 1860s, most settlements were temporary. Mining camps would spring up overnight when gold or silver was discovered, and they'd empty out just as fast when the veins ran dry. Entire towns could rise and fall within a year or two, and the populations were almost entirely transient. These were young men, being mostly in their 20s and 30s, who had left their families back east to chase fortune and adventure in the West. They worked grueling jobs, mining, ranching, hauling freight, laying railroad tracks, and at the end of the day, they had nowhere to go. No homes, no wives, no children, just a bedroll in a tent or a bunk in a crowded boarding house. The saloon, crude as it was, became the only social outlet they had. And the people you'd find inside weren't outlaws or gunslingers. They were regular men trying to survive. Cowboys would stop in to broker deals with other ranchers, negotiating the sale of cattle or horses over a shared drink. Travelers passing through on wagon trains would seek out the saloon for basic conversation, desperate to talk to someone, anyone, after weeks of isolation on the trail. Soldiers stationed at nearby forts would wander in on their days off, looking to escape the monotony of military life. Laborers who spent their days breaking rocks or felling trees would sit by the stove, warming their hands and sharing stories of where they came from and where they hoped to go. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't exciting, but it was human. The first recorded saloon in American history was a place called Brown's Hole, and it perfectly encapsulates what these early establishments were like. Located on the edge of present-day Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah, Brown's Hole opened in 1822 to serve fur trappers and traders working in the remote wilderness of the Rocky Mountains. There was no town, no settlement, just a trading post and a tent where men could buy raw alcohol and rest for a night before heading back into the mountains. The owner sold whiskey to trappers in exchange for pelts, and the operation was successful enough to stay open for years, becoming a fixture of the region's early economy. Brown's Hole wasn't unique. Across the frontier, dozens, maybe hundreds, of similar operations popped up wherever people gathered, however briefly. They were called saloons, but that word didn't carry the weight it would later. It was just a place to drink and talk, nothing more. But even in these early humble forms, saloons were already becoming something greater than the sum of their parts. Because here's the thing, these men had nothing else. No churches to attend on Sundays, no town halls to gather in for community meetings, no social clubs or fraternal organizations. The saloon was it. It was the only place where a man could sit down, get warm, and feel like part of something larger than himself. And the saloon keepers understood this. They weren't just selling alcohol, they were selling relief from loneliness. They were offering a space where men could share their burdens, their hopes, and their frustrations with people who understood what frontier life was really like. Over time, as mining camps began to stabilize and populations started to settle rather than drift, these tent saloons evolved. The canvas gave way to wooden planks. The dirt floors were covered with rough-hewn boards. The single stove was joined by tables, chairs, and eventually a proper bar. But in those early years, the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, the saloon was just a tent. 4 posts, a tarp, a stove, and a dream. And for the men who walked through the flap and sat down by the fire, it was enough. It had to be. Because in a world where everything was temporary, where fortunes could be made and lost in a single season, where entire towns could vanish into memory, the saloon was the one constant, the one place that said, "You're not alone out here. Sit down, have a drink, stay a while." That was the promise of the early saloon. Not excitement, not danger, just the simple, profound comfort of not being alone in the middle of nowhere. And as small as that sounds, it was everything. That was the promise of the early saloon. Not excitement, not danger, just the simple, profound comfort of not being alone in the middle of nowhere. And as small as that sounds, it was everything. But as boom towns grew and populations stabilized, that tent saloon wouldn't be enough anymore. The West needed something bigger, something permanent. And saloon owners were about to become the most important builders of civilization the frontier had ever seen. One building served as bar, church, courthouse, job fair, and brothel, sometimes all in the same week. And in many frontier towns, that building was the only permanent structure for miles. As boom towns began to stabilize and population shifted from transient to semi-permanent, saloons evolved from crude tents into actual buildings. But they didn't just become better bars, they became the entire infrastructure of the community. In a place with no government funding, no established institutions, and no tradition of civic planning, the saloon filled every gap. And saloon owners knew it. They built accordingly. The transformation happened gradually, tracking the expansion of the railroad and the discovery of valuable resources. When gold was found in California in 1848, tent saloons appeared overnight. When silver was discovered in Nevada in the 1850s, the same pattern repeated. When the Transcontinental Railroad pushed westward in the 1860s, saloons sprouted along every mile of track. But the real explosion came when towns stopped moving. Denver, Colorado is the perfect example. In 1860, the city had roughly 30 saloons, a respectable number for a town of its size. By 1890, just 3 decades later, that number had grown to 478. 478 saloons in a single city. That's more than one saloon for every 100 residents. The growth wasn't random. It tracked directly with population increases, economic development, and the establishment of permanent settlements. People were no longer just passing through, they were staying. And when people stayed, they needed more than just a drink. They needed community. They needed services. They needed infrastructure. Saloons provided all three. In the earliest days of a new settlement, before churches were built or town councils were formed, the saloon was the default gathering place for everything. And I mean everything. Sunday mornings, the saloon would close for regular business, not because the owner was particularly religious, but out of respect for the traveling clergy who would arrive to hold services. In towns that didn't yet have a church building, which was most of them, the saloon became the sanctuary. The same tables where men had been playing faro and drinking whiskey the night before were cleared off, and benches were arranged in rows. A preacher would stand at the front of the room, often near the bar itself, and deliver a sermon to whoever showed up. It wasn't unusual for a Baptist minister to preach temperance and moral living in the very place where those vices were sold 6 days a week. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, but it didn't matter. The saloon was the only building large enough to hold a congregation, and so that's where church happened. Monday morning, the same room might host a town council meeting. In settlements that lacked a proper government building, again, most of them, local leaders would gather at the saloon to vote on ordinances, settle disputes, and make decisions about the town's future. The saloon owner often played a key role in these meetings, not just as a host, but as a participant. In many cases, he was one of the wealthiest and most influential men in town, and his opinion carried weight. By Tuesday, a circuit judge might arrive. The frontier legal system was sparse and inconsistent, with judges traveling from town to hear cases and settle disputes. When they arrived, they needed a courtroom. The saloon provided one. Trials were held at the same tables where card games had been played the night before. Witnesses testified. Verdicts were handed down. Justice, rough as it was served. Wednesday, the saloon might host a job fair. Unemployed men, and there were always unemployed men drifting through frontier towns, would gather to meet with ranchers, mine owners, and construction foremen looking to hire. The saloon was the natural meeting place because everyone already knew where it was and everyone already went there. Thursday, Friday, Saturday, back to regular business, drinking, gambling, socializing, and occasionally, yes, the kind of entertainment that church-going folks preferred not to talk about. The saloon wasn't just a bar. It was the town square, the city hall, the chapel, and the hiring hall all rolled into one. And in many cases, it was also the inn, the general store, and the post office. Some saloons in remote areas would set aside a corner of the building for a few beds, offering basic lodging to travelers who had nowhere else to stay. Others would stock shelves with dry goods, flour, salt, tobacco, ammunition, turning the saloon into a makeshift trading post. A few even handled mail delivery, serving as the unofficial post office until a proper one could be established. The saloon owners who ran these operations weren't just bartenders. They were community organizers, entrepreneurs, and often the closest thing a settlement had to a mayor. They took on these roles not out of altruism, but out of necessity and opportunity. If you owned the only large building in town, you had leverage, you had influence, and if you were smart, you used that influence to make yourself indispensable. But not all saloons were created equal. As towns grew and competition increased, saloons began to differentiate themselves. Some catered to wealthy merchants and business owners, offering finer liquor, better furniture, and a more respectable atmosphere. Others remained rough-and-tumble establishments, serving the miners, laborers, and drifters who couldn't afford anything better. And in some regions, particularly in Texas and other states along the southern border, saloons became segregated along racial lines. This wasn't universal. In fact, the further west you traveled, the less segregation you saw. California, Nevada, and the Pacific Northwest had saloons where black cowboys, Chinese railroad workers, Mexican vaqueros, and white settlers all drank together without issue. The frontier was harsh enough that many communities simply couldn't afford to turn away paying customers based on race. But in Texas and parts of the Southwest, the social and racial divides that had defined the South before and during the Civil War carried over into saloon culture. Some establishments were explicitly whites only. Others were known as black saloons or Mexican saloons, serving specific communities and rarely mixing. It's an uncomfortable reality and one that contradicts the romantic notion of the frontier as a place of equality and freedom. The truth is more complicated. The West was more open than the East in many ways, but it wasn't a utopia. Prejudice existed. It just varied depending on where you were and who was running the town. Still, for all their flaws, saloons remained the most important social institution on the frontier. They weren't perfect, but they were essential. And as towns continued to grow, saloons grew with them, evolving from simple wooden buildings into something closer to what we recognize today. The decor started to improve. In the Great Plains states, Kansas, Nebraska, the Dakotas, saloons would hang cowboy gear on the walls, lassos, spurs, branding irons, horse saddles. It was part decoration, part practicality. Cowboys would sometimes sell or trade their equipment at the saloon, and the owner would display it as both advertisement and inventory. In the Rocky Mountain territories, Colorado, Montana, Wyoming, saloons favored a different aesthetic. Bearskins, elk antlers, and mounted deer heads adorned the walls, signaling the rugged hunting-focused culture of the region. These weren't just trophies, they were conversation starters, proof of survival in a dangerous landscape. On the Pacific Coast, in cities like San Francisco and Portland, saloons took on a more cosmopolitan character. Large mirrors were installed behind the bars, making the rooms feel bigger and brighter. Chandeliers, real glass chandeliers, hung from the ceilings, a sign of wealth and ambition. These were the saloons that attracted businessmen, politicians, and travelers from back east, and they were designed to impress. But even in the fanciest saloons, the core function remained the same, bringing people together. Whether you walked into a dirt-floored tent in a mining camp or a chandelier-lit palace in San Francisco, the saloon served the same purpose. It was a place to connect, to do business, to find work, to hear news, to escape loneliness, boredom, and the grinding monotony of frontier life. Churches would eventually be built, courthouses would eventually rise, schools, libraries, and town halls would eventually follow. But in the early days, before any of that existed, there was the saloon. And for better or worse, the saloon built the town around it. But none of this, the church services, the town meetings, the job fairs, could happen without the one person who made the saloon work. And that person wasn't just pouring drinks. He was holding the entire community together with a shotgun, a smile, and sheer force of will. The man pouring your drink was also the bouncer, the entertainer, the cook, and he had a shotgun under the bar. If he failed at any of these jobs, the saloon collapsed, and if the saloon collapsed, so did the town bartenders in the Wild West weren't just service workers. They were the architects of frontier social life, the enforcers of order in places that had no law, and often the most respected figures in town. The job required skills far beyond mixing drinks. You had to be a diplomat, a psychologist, a businessman, and occasionally a gunfighter. And if you were good at it, people called you Professor. The nickname wasn't ironic. It was a genuine title of respect, bestowed on bartenders who had mastered their craft and earned the trust of their communities. A professor wasn't just someone who could pour whiskey. He was someone who could read a room, defuse a tense situation, organize entertainment, manage finances, and keep a saloon running smoothly even when chaos threatened to break loose. By 1900, there were approximately 50,000 bartenders working across the United States, and the competition among them was fierce. A talented bartender could command respect, earn substantial tips, and even become a minor celebrity in his town. A bad bartender wouldn't last a week. The responsibilities were staggering. First and foremost, a bartender had to know how to mix drinks, and mix them well. In the early days when most alcohol was homemade rot gut, this wasn't difficult. You poured whatever was in the bottle and hoped the customer survived. But as saloons became more sophisticated and quality alcohol became more available, bartenders were expected to know their craft. They learned to mix classic cocktails, they experimented with flavors, they developed house specialties that kept customers coming back. The best bartenders prided themselves on their skill, treating drink mixing as an art form rather than just a job. But mixing drinks was only the beginning. Bartenders were also responsible for security. In a frontier saloon, there was no bouncer standing at the door checking IDs. There was no police force you could call if things got out of hand. If a fight broke out, if a drunk customer became violent, if a card game turned into a brawl, the bartender had to handle it. And handle it he did. Most bartenders kept a weapon within arm's reach at all times. A rifle, a shotgun, Or a revolver would be stashed under the bar, ready to be pulled out at a moment's notice. The mere presence of the weapon was usually enough to keep trouble at bay. Customers knew the bartender was armed, and they knew he wouldn't hesitate to use it if necessary. But good bartenders rarely had to. The best ones could diffuse tension with a joke, a free drink, or a firm but calm reminder that violence wasn't welcome in their establishment. They had a presence and authority that commanded respect without needing to fire a shot. Still, when violence did erupt, bartenders were expected to step in. Some did so with their fists, others brandished their weapons and ordered combatants to leave. A few, very few, actually fired, but the threat was always there, and it kept most saloons safer than you might expect. Beyond security, bartenders were also the primary entertainers in many saloons. If there was no traveling music troupe in town, no dance hall girls, no car dealers, it was the bartender's job to keep things interesting. Some bartenders were talented musicians playing piano, guitar, or fiddle during slow nights to keep the atmosphere lively. Others were skilled storytellers, regaling customers with tall tales, news from other towns, or gossip about local scandals. A few were genuine showmen, performing tricks, juggling bottles, flipping glasses, lighting drinks on fire, to impress their patrons and drum up business. The bartender was also the social coordinator. If a visiting entertainer came through town, the bartender arranged the performance and set the schedule. If a local wanted to organize a boxing match or a shooting contest, the bartender helped make it happen. If someone needed to spread word about a town meeting or a church service, they told the bartender, and he passed the message along. In many ways, the bartender was the town's unofficial communications hub. Everyone came through the saloon eventually, and the bartender heard everything. He knew who was hiring, who was looking for work, who had money troubles, who was feuding with whom. He was the keeper of information, and smart bartenders used that knowledge to their advantage. And if the saloon didn't have a cook, which many didn't, the bartender handled that too. Most saloons didn't serve full meals, but they often offered simple snacks: hard-boiled eggs, pickled vegetables, crackers, cheese. The bartender prepared these himself, keeping them behind the bar and selling them for a few cents apiece. If the saloon didn't have a cleaning crew, which most didn't, the bartender handled that as well, sweeping floors, wiping down tables, washing glasses, emptying spittoons. It was unglamorous work, but it had to be done, and in small-town saloons, the bartender did it himself. The job was exhausting. Bartenders often worked 12 to 16-hour shifts, opening the saloon in the late morning and closing it well past midnight. They were on their feet all day, constantly moving, constantly managing, constantly watching for trouble. But the rewards could be significant. A successful bartender in a thriving town could make a comfortable living, especially if he owned the saloon himself. Tips were common, and generous customers would sometimes pay double or triple the cost of a drink just to show their appreciation. And some bartenders became local legends. Famous cowboys and frontiersmen who eventually retired from the trail would take up bartending, bringing their reputations with them. Customers would flock to the saloon just to meet the man behind the bar, and the bartender would use his fame to draw crowds and boost business. Bartending was also one of the few professions on the frontier that allowed for upward mobility. A laborer or miner might spend his entire life breaking his back for minimal pay, but a talented bartender could save enough money to buy his own saloon or even open multiple locations. Bartending was a path to independence, respect, and financial security, if you were good at it. But for all the prestige and skill involved, the job also came with indignities. One of the most notorious aspects of saloon life was the communal towel. Napkins didn't exist in the Wild West. Paper products were expensive and impractical, and cloth napkins were a luxury reserved for fine dining establishments back east. In frontier saloons, there was only the towel, This was a single, filthy rag that hung from a clip or hook beneath the bar. After finishing a drink, customers would use it to wipe beer foam or whiskey residue from their mustaches, beards, and lips. Then they'd hang it back up for the next person to use. 50 men might use that same towel in a single night. It would be soaked with spit, sweat, alcohol, and God knows what else by the end of the evening. And the bartender was responsible for washing it, or more likely, just letting it dry overnight and reusing it the next day. It was disgusting, it was unsanitary, and it was completely normal. While bartenders also had to deal with the complete lack of bar stools. Despite what you see in movies, bar stools didn't exist in most Wild West saloons. Instead, there was a long metal rail fastened a few inches above the floor, running the length of the bar. Customers would prop one foot on the rail and lean forward against the bar top, standing in a relaxed but upright position. If someone really wanted to sit, they had to find a table. The bar itself was standing room only. This wasn't an oversight. It was intentional. Saloon owners wanted customers to keep moving, keep drinking, keep spending. If you were standing, you were less likely to settle in for hours nursing a single drink. You'd finish, order another, and eventually move on, making room for the next customer. The bartender managed all of this. The weapons, the entertainment, the cooking, the cleaning, the crowd control, the business operations. He was a one-man operation in most small-town saloons, and even in larger establishments, he was the linchpin holding everything together. Without the bartender, there was no saloon. Without the saloon, there was no town. And the best bartenders, the professors, understood this. They took pride in their work, not because it was glamorous, but because it mattered. They were building something in the middle of nowhere, one drink at a time. The bartender kept order, poured drinks, and held the community together. But he wasn't the only draw. What really packed saloons night after night wasn't the alcohol or the entertainment. It was the games. Men would sit at tables for hours, betting everything they had on the turn of a card. And the game they played wasn't poker. And it was something you've probably never heard of. The most popular gambling game in the Wild West wasn't poker. It was a card game called Faro. And if you've never heard of it, you're not alone. Faro has almost completely disappeared from modern gambling culture. But in the 19th century, it was everywhere. It was faster than poker, simpler than poker, and far more democratic than poker. A single Faro table could accommodate an unlimited number of players. You didn't need skill or strategy or even a basic understanding of card probabilities. You just needed a few cents and the willingness to take a chance. That accessibility made Faro the most popular game on the frontier by a staggering margin, and nearly every saloon, from the smallest tent operation to the fanciest San Francisco parlor, had at least one Faro table running. So how did it work? The game was deceptively simple. A standard deck of playing cards was used, and 13 cards of the same suit, say, all the spades, were laid face up on the table in order from ace to king. These cards represented the betting board. Players would place their bets on whichever denomination they thought would win that round. You could bet on the 3, the 7, the queen, whatever you wanted. There was no limit to how many people could bet on the same card, and you could spread your money across multiple cards if you felt lucky. Once all the bets were placed, the dealer, called the banker, would draw 2 cards from the deck. The first card drawn was the banker's card. Any bets placed on that denomination were losers, and the banker collected the money. The second card drawn was the player's card. Any bets placed on that denomination were winners, and the banker paid them out at even odds. That was it. 1 round, 2 cards, winners and losers determined in seconds. Then the process repeated. Players could rearrange their bets, add more money, or walk away. The game moved fast, much faster than poker, and that speed was part of the appeal. You could play dozens of rounds in an hour, and each round gave you a fresh chance to win. The simplicity was brilliant. You didn't need to know how to bluff. You didn't need to read your opponents or calculate pot odds. You just picked a card, placed your bet, and watched the dealer draw. It was pure chance, and everyone understood that. But pure chance didn't mean fair. Faro had a reputation for being one of the most honest games in the saloon when it was played straight. The odds were transparent, the rules were clear, and if the dealer wasn't cheating, the house edge was relatively small compared to other gambling games of the era. The problem was that many dealers were cheating. Crooked faro dealers were legendary on the frontier. They used rigged decks, marked cards, and sleight-of-hand techniques to manipulate the outcome of each draw. Some dealers worked with accomplices in the crowd, signaling which cards to bet on to create the illusion of random wins while the house quietly raked in profits. The most common cheating method involved a device called a faro box, a small dealing shoe that allowed the dealer to control which cards came out and in what order. A skilled cheat could use the box to ensure that the banker's card always won more often than the player's card, is tilting the odds heavily in the house's favor. Players knew this was happening, everyone knew, but they played anyway. Because even at a rigged table, there was always a chance you'd get lucky. A chance you'd walk away with more money than you came in with. A chance you'd beat the odds and have a story to tell. And for men who spent their days in monotonous, back-breaking labor, mining, ranching, hauling freight, that chance was worth the risk. Faro wasn't the only game in town, of course. Poker existed, though it wasn't yet the cultural phenomenon it would later become. The version most commonly played in saloons was five-card draw, a straightforward game where each player was dealt 5 cards and could discard and replace a few in hopes of building a better hand. Poker required more skill than faro, and it attracted a different crowd. Serious gamblers, men who studied the game, who understood probabilities, who could bluff and read their opponents, gravitated toward poker. These were the professional gamblers, the card sharps, the men who made their living at the tables. But poker was slower. It required patience, focus, and a bankroll large enough to weather losing streaks. Most saloon patrons didn't have that kind of money or time. They wanted action, and they wanted it fast. Faro gave them that. Another popular game was three-card Monte, a street con that somehow found its way into saloons. The dealer would place 3 cards face down on the table and shuffle them around, challenging players to identify which one was the queen. It was a simple game of observation and memory, except that it was almost always rigged. The dealer would use sleight of hand to swap cards, palm the queen, or otherwise manipulate the game to ensure that players almost never won. Three-card Monte was less a game and more a scam, but it drew crowds because it was fast, flashy, and entertaining to watch, even if you weren't playing. Roulette also existed, but only in the fanciest saloons. Roulette wheels were expensive, required significant space, and needed a skilled operator to run properly. Most small-town saloons couldn't afford them. But in places like San Francisco, Denver, and New Orleans, high-end gambling halls would feature ornate roulette tables alongside faro, poker, and other games of chance. For the average saloon, though, faro was king. The cultural dominance of faro is hard to overstate. It wasn't just popular, it was ubiquitous. Nearly every depiction of gambling in the Wild West, every story of fortunes won and lost, every tale of a gambler's downfall or miraculous comeback, involved faro. Men would sit at faro tables for hours, sometimes all night, betting small amounts on each round and chasing the elusive big win. A laborer who made $1 a day might bet 5 or 10 cents per round, losing slowly over the course of an evening, always convinced that the next draw would turn his luck around. And sometimes it did. Every saloon had stories of men who won big at faro, who turned a few cents into a few dollars, or a few dollars into enough money to buy a new horse, or pay off a debt, or stake a claim in a new mining camp. Those stories kept people playing. The dream of a big win, however unlikely, was enough to bring men back to the tables night after night. But for every winner, there were a dozen losers. Men who gambled away their wages, their savings, their future. Men who walked into the saloon with a week's pay and walked out with nothing. Men who borrowed money to keep playing, convinced that the next round would make everything right, only to dig themselves deeper into debt. Gambling addiction wasn't called that in the 19th century, but it existed. And Pharaoh, with its speed and simplicity, was perfectly designed to exploit it. Still, for most men, gambling wasn't about addiction. It was about entertainment. It was about the thrill of risk, the camaraderie of sitting around a table with other players, the shared experience of winning and losing together. A night at the faro table was a break from the brutal monotony of frontier life. It was a chance to feel something: excitement, hope, disappointment, the triumph, in a world that often felt numbingly repetitive. And that's why men kept playing. Not because they thought they'd get rich, but because for a few hours, sitting at that table, betting on the turn of a card, they felt alive. The game was rigged. The odds were terrible. The house almost always won. But none of that mattered. Because the alternative, going back to a cold tent, a lonely bunk, a life of endless work with no relief, was somehow worse. For many men, the saloon and its games were harmless escapes. But not everyone saw it that way. A growing movement of reformers, preachers, and activists believed that saloons, and the gambling, drinking, and vice they enabled, were destroying American civilization. And they were prepared to do something about it. By the late 1800s, saloons had an enemy more terrifying than any outlaw: the Temperance Movement. For decades, saloons had been the social and economic centers of frontier towns. They'd built communities, hosted churches, facilitated business, and provided the only entertainment available in isolated settlements. But as the West became more settled and populations grew more stable, a new narrative began to take hold. Saloons, once seen as necessary institutions, were now being painted as threats to civilization itself. The people leading this charge weren't outlaws or criminals. They were middle-class reformers, Christian activists, and women's rights advocates who genuinely believed that alcohol, gambling, and prostitution were destroying American society. And they weren't entirely wrong. Alcoholism was a genuine problem in the 19th century. Men would drink themselves into poverty, neglecting their families, and squandering their wages on whiskey and card games. Domestic violence rates were high, and alcohol was often a contributing factor. Women and children suffered the consequences of their husbands' and fathers' drinking habits, and they had almost no legal recourse to protect themselves. Into this environment stepped the Temperance Movement, a broad coalition of reformers who believed that banning alcohol would solve these problems. And at the center of their campaign was the saloon. The Anti-Saloon League, founded in 1893, became one of the most powerful advocacy organizations in American history. They organized protests, published pamphlets, lobbied politicians, and mobilized voters with a single-minded focus: shut down the saloons. Their tactics were aggressive and highly visible. Protesters would gather outside saloons, often in large groups, shouting warnings to anyone who tried to enter. They carried signs with slogans like, "Lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours," and "The saloon must go." They sang hymns, recited Bible verses, and publicly shamed customers by name. For many saloon owners, the protests were a nuisance, but not a serious threat. Business continued. Men still drank. The movement seemed loud, but ultimately ineffective. Then came Carrie Nation. Carrie Nation was a Kansas woman who took the temperance movement to its most extreme and literal conclusion. She didn't just protest saloons, she destroyed them. Armed with a hatchet, Nation would march into saloons in broad daylight and begin smashing everything in sight. Bottles of whiskey shattered against the walls, mirrors were reduced to shards of glass, furniture was overturned and splintered. Faro tables were chopped to pieces. She called it hatchetation, and she became a national sensation. Nation was arrested more than 30 times for destruction of property. But she never stopped. She paid her fines with money raised from supporters who saw her as a righteous crusader fighting moral decay. She gave speeches, published a newsletter, and sold souvenir hatchets to fund her campaign. And she wasn't alone. Nation inspired dozens of other women to take similar action. Groups of women armed with axes, hammers, and clubs would descend on saloons, smashing their way through the interior, while saloon owners and customers watched in shock. The legal system struggled to respond. Technically, if these women were committing crimes, vandalism, destruction of property, trespassing, but prosecuting them was politically complicated. Many judges and juries were sympathetic to the temperance cause, and convicting a group of church-going women for attacking institutions associated with vice and sin didn't sit well with public opinion. So the destruction continued. The temperance movement wasn't just about violence, though. It was also a sophisticated political operation. The Anti-Saloon League and other organizations lobbied state legislatures to pass laws restricting alcohol sales, limiting saloon hours, and increasing taxes on liquor. They campaigned for politicians who supported prohibition and worked to vote out those who didn't. By the early 20th century, the movement had achieved significant success. Several states had already implemented statewide prohibition laws, banning the sale of alcohol entirely. Saloons in those states were forced to close, and their owners either moved to states where alcohol was still legal or found new lines of work. The irony of the entire movement was impossible to ignore. Saloons had done more to build civilization in the West than almost any other institution. They'd served as churches, courthouses, town halls, job centers, and social hubs. They'd provided entertainment, community, and connection in places that had nothing else, but they'd also enabled genuine harm. Alcoholism, gambling addiction, violence, and exploitation were real problems that affected real families. The reformers weren't making up stories about drunken husbands or ruined lives. Those things happened. In a way, both sides were right. Saloons had been vital to the survival and growth of frontier communities, but they'd also created social costs that couldn't be ignored. The question wasn't whether saloons had done good or bad. They'd done both. The question was whether the good outweighed the bad. The temperance movement answered that question with a resounding no. And in 1920, they won. The passage of the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act ushered in prohibition, a nationwide ban on the production, sale, and transportation of alcohol. Saloons across the country were forced to close their doors. The era of the Wild West saloon, already fading as the frontier vanished and towns modernized, came to an official end. Prohibition would last 13 years before being repealed in 1933. Widely regarded as a failed experiment. But by then, the world had changed. The saloons of the 19th century were gone, replaced by a new generation of bars, taverns, and speakeasies that operated in a fundamentally different cultural and legal landscape. The old saloons, the ones that had built towns, hosted churches, and provided the only social infrastructure on the frontier, existed only in memory. But before they disappeared, they were attacked, vilified, and literally smashed to pieces by axe-wielding reformers who believed they were saving civilization. And in the end, the reformers got what they wanted. The saloons were gone. Whether that made the world better or worse is still up for debate. So what were Wild West saloons actually like? They were vital and flawed, necessary and destructive. They were places where lonely men found community, where towns were built from nothing, and where vices flourished alongside genuine human connection. They were, in short, far more complicated than any movie ever showed. So what were Wild West saloons actually like? They were vital and flawed, necessary and destructive. They were places where lonely men found community, where towns were built from nothing, and where vices flourished alongside genuine human connection. They were, in short, far more complicated than any movie ever showed. The drinks were terrible, poisonous mixtures of raw alcohol and whatever ingredients could stretch the supply. But men drank them anyway, because warmth and relief were worth the risk. The buildings were crude, canvas tents and wooden shacks that barely kept out the cold, but they served as churches, courthouses, and town halls, filling every gap in frontier infrastructure. The bartenders were armed enforcers and community organizers, holding entire towns together with shotguns, charm, and sheer competence. The games were rigged, faro tables run by crooked dealers who manipulated the odds. But men played anyway, chasing the hope of a win that might change their fortunes. And the whole enterprise was eventually targeted, attacked, and destroyed by reformers who saw saloons as symbols of moral decay, even though those same saloons had built the civilization the reformers were trying to protect. Hollywood gave us gunfights and poker games and dramatic showdowns at high noon. The reality was quieter, stranger, and more human. It was a miner nursing a warm beer after a 16-hour shift, a cowboy brokering a cattle deal over a shot of whiskey, a traveler finding conversation after weeks of isolation on the trail, a preacher delivering a Sunday sermon in the same room where men had gambled the night before. Saloons weren't just about what happened inside their walls. They were about what happened when you put desperate, ambitious, lonely people in the same room and gave them a reason to stay. And that, chaos, community, and all, is what actually built the West.